One of the things they don't teach you in music school is what are you supposed to do when you receive a commissioning agreement. Most composers I know just kind of take a look at it and then just sign it right away, send it back, or even sometimes wait weeks and weeks and weeks before they sign it. Or in cases of some other composers I know, they sign it after the premiere. But in today's video, we're going to talk about what you should look at when you see one of these commission agreements and what things to kind of keep an eye out for when you're reading one of these agreements. All right, here we go. Let's dive in now to one of my own commissioning agreements. Right at the top, we see that the agreement was made on so-and-so day between so-and-so orchestra and the composer, that's me. The next thing that we have to see is what is this piece going to be for and how long is the piece going to be. So you think this is an obvious thing, but it needs to be spelled out in the agreement. So in this case, it's an original musical work for symphony orchestra that's approximately 15 minutes long. So right there we know what our assignment is as a composer. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about whether this is half an hour, 5 minutes, 1 hour. Is this a ballet? Is this a trio? Is this a solo piece for kazoo and electronics? No, it's a symphony orchestral work that's about 15 minutes long. So I would say maybe somewhere between 12 and 17, 18 minutes. Usually that's what approximately 15 minutes means. It doesn't mean 25 minutes, right? And then it says here that the full orchestration is set forth in Exhibit A. So this is going to be an extra page at the end of the document that just gives you what is the full list of instrumentation that you can go with. The next thing that we're going to need to know is when is our piece going to be performed? Is it going to be performed in spring 2023? Is it going to be performed on October 1st? 2025. We need to know approximately at least when this thing is going to be played. I think it's okay if it tells you spring 2022 versus a calendar date, for example. But in my experience, it's a lot better to know exactly when the performances are going to happen so you can plan in advance on being there. And of course, on kind of figuring out when do you need to have your piece done. So that's going to be your second item on this agreement. Another item that needs to be in your commissioning agreement is a blurb about scores, parts, and copying. As far as scores go, they're usually going to want to have 2 or 3 hard copies of your score that is spiral bound on the left-hand side. That way they can keep the score in their archives, or if there's a conductor or assistant conductor, they can also have a copy of the score. And it's just better this way that they actually have a hard, tangible score lying around. Maybe they'll play your piece again in a future season, and if it's there actually in their hands, they're going to remember the piece a little bit more than if you just sent it to them electronically. When you're dealing with parts for an orchestra or an ensemble, there are going to be one of 2 methods that get employed here. The first one is digitized copies, in other words, PDFs. Now, what I like to do if the orchestra or the organization requests PDFs is that I like to have a watermark on the bottom of each PDF page saying that this piece is licensed for use by this specific organization for this specific date. That way I know that they have that piece for that duration of time, and I know that I have them playing that particular work. And this way they can't easily lend out the piece to other organizations to play. Otherwise, I could find out later on that these other organizations are playing the work without my permission. So that's number 1, digitized PDFs. I used to not really believe in this, but now that we're getting more and more into the 21st century, it's getting harder and harder to not send digitized PDFs. It's easier on the composer side as well as the ensemble or organization side. So oftentimes I'm okay with digital parts. The second thing that you could do with parts is send hard copy parts, usually an 8.5 by 11 or 9 by 12 format if you're dealing with orchestra. There are 2 ways you can do hard copy parts. The first way is that each player in the orchestra, no matter what they play, gets their own part. So for example, the clarinets all get their own part. Clarinet 1, clarinet 2, clarinet 3, etc. The percussionists all get their own part, the timpanist, etc. The string players all get their own part. So even if there are 10 first violins, for example, but there are only 5 stands, it doesn't matter. All 10 violin players get their own violin 1 part, okay? That's the first method of sending hard copy parts. The second method has to do more specifically with the string players. The second method has to do with giving one part, one hard copy part, per stand. Let's say you have 10 violins in the first violin section, and there are 5 stands, 2 players per stand. Now, in the second way, you only have to give 5 parts, so there would be one hard copy per stand. And actually, that's a lot easier, of course, for the composer, because you don't have to supply all those different parts. You just have to give half of what you normally would give. And in reality, most string players are not going to practice their part away from the rehearsal. And that's, of course, a different story, but this is just the reality of things. So oftentimes, I would be asked to just give one hard copy per stand in the string section. And of course, the last part of this provision is copying. Who is going to pay for the copying for the piece? Is it going to be you as the composer, or is it going to be the organization? Now, oftentimes what happens nowadays is that the fee that you're given is going to cover everything. And for me, this is a bit better because then I can control exactly where the money goes. If I'm stuck on time, I can pay someone to do the engraving. But if someone gave me an engraving fee and then I have to end up doing the engraving myself, that's money that could have been spent on the commission itself. So I prefer to keep the fees all in one package deal, just kind of like how film composers do. They usually do something called a package deal, where they give them one fixed amount and the composer can do anything they see fit with that amount. The next thing we have to talk about is fee structure. How is this organization going to pay for your piece? Usually what happens is they're going to pay the first half as a lump sum out front, right when you sign the contract. So once you and the organization sign a contract, you should be able to receive that first half check within, let's say, 30 days of you both signing the contract. And then you would get the second half of this lump sum for your commission about, let's say, 30 days after you complete the piece. In other words, deliver the piece. Now, depending on who you are, you might love or hate this. Most people, I think, love this because they get to have some amount of money in the beginning and then some amount of money at the end. So that way the money is spaced apart and you could use it while you're working on the piece. Other people, there is this intrinsic pressure when you receive that first half that you have to write the piece. And if things kind of go astray, it's difficult to give that money back, especially if you spent it. But the way I am, I want to have that first half so that it could be working for me, whether I need to pay rent or buy food or even invest that money while I'm working on the piece. So I think this fee structure makes sense. A provision that I feel like gets overlooked is this idea that an agreement needs to include not just things about the commission itself, but what does the composer do during the week of the performance? Mainly, what does the composer do in terms of travel and accommodation? Is the travel going to be reimbursed? In other words, do you have to pay for your plane ticket, train ticket, Uber ride, and then they would reimburse you at a certain time later after the commission? Or are they going to provide all of that stuff for you? The same goes for accommodation in terms of a hotel, or perhaps they're going to have you stay with a board member or another host. These things need to be spelled out in the agreement. I feel like they need to be spelled out in the agreement even if you live in the place where your piece is going to be performed. You never know where you're going to be these days. You could possibly have another performance the week before, or perhaps you're visiting family that week. I think, or really the week before or the week after, not that week you want to be at your gig, right? I think it's important that this provision is in the agreement even if you live in that city. So highly, highly, highly important in my opinion. The next provision is probably the most provision in the entire agreement, and you need to read this extremely carefully, and that is rights. What rights do you and the organization have in terms of this agreement? So the first thing that we're going to talk about is who actually owns the copyright to the piece. Now, if the organization tells you that this is a work for hire commission, or if they tell you that they own the piece outright, take that contract and just rip it up to shreds in front of them. Or just don't answer the email at all. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, answer, but tell them that this is your piece, you wrote the piece, And the piece is not a work for hire piece. This is not a film, right? This is not a project where there are several creative voices contributing to one thing. This is a project where you're writing a piece and that particular organization is playing it for the first time. It's not like their piece and that's it. You're going to want to have your piece performed by other organizations, by other ensembles, and that first organization is going to want that piece also to have a life. So it doesn't make sense for your piece to be under their, copyright strain. So in my opinion, make sure that this rights part of your agreement says that you are the sole copyright holder of the piece, both writer and publisher rights. Now, there is a part B to this, and that is, now that you are the copyright holder of your commissioned piece, you are also entitled to either ASCAP or BMI royalties after the piece is premiered. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's say you have an orchestral performance and it's going to be played 3 times in one weekend. That means that if you are the copyright holder of this piece, you're going to get 100% of the royalties that come from these 3 performances, either through ASCAP or BMI, or if you're in Canada, it's going to be CSAC. So that's an extremely important provision. No organization is going to tell you that it's not okay for you to be the sole copyright holder of your works. And if they do, just turn 180 degrees and run the other way, because this is just not something that is supposed to be in these agreements. And these organizations know that. So that's number one. The second part of these rights that you need to know about are what we call exclusivity rights. In other words, how long does this ensemble have to play the piece without anyone else performing the piece? So for example, an ensemble might want to have exclusivity for 1 whole year from the date of the premiere. So for example, if they are premiering the piece on, let's say, December 1st, 2021, and they want 1 year exclusivity, that means the next ensemble that performs the piece can perform the piece starting on December 2nd, 2022. See what I mean here? Sometimes they even want 2-year exclusivity, sometimes 3-year exclusivity. Sometimes they don't even say anything about exclusivity, in which case you just completely pretend like it's not even there, right? Because that way, for example, let's say your piece is getting played by, a string quartet. Well, if the piece is successful and some other string quartet wants to perform the piece, well, you can just have that string quartet perform the piece, a month later, 2 months later, or whenever during that year, instead of waiting till after an exclusivity period. And that's better for you, obviously, as the composer. So this is something I would keep in mind, and this can be also a negotiating tool if you think that the commission fee is too low. For example, if they say, we want the piece for 3 years, well, just say, no, you can only have the piece for 1 year and see what they say. Maybe you meet somewhere in the middle and say 2 years. I wouldn't, maybe when you're reading this agreement, you think, I don't think anyone's going to play the piece within a year. You never know. You never know what's going to happen a year down the line, 6 months down the line, 2 months down the line. You want to make sure that as many things as possible are in your favor that you can, especially if you cannot get the fee up in your commissioning agreement. Now, the last part of this agreement has to do with termination and cancellation. So here in this agreement that I have, it says, if for any reason composer fails to fulfill the terms of this commission agreement in regard to adherence to the schedule for delivery of score and parts, etc., orchestra and composer agree to seek a mutually agreeable rescheduling of the world premiere of the composition. I would make sure that this specific clause is in the agreement, because you never know. There might be a time, maybe you're very busy and you just don't have time to finish this piece. It would be really terrible if, let's say, you got to the end or almost the end of when the piece is supposed to be delivered and you just can't deliver the piece. This provision here allows you to actually communicate with the organization and see if there can be a mutually agreeable time that you can have the piece premiered. Let's keep going. If such rescheduling is unable to be agreed upon by both parties, or composer fails to adhere to non-scheduling terms of this commission, the orchestra shall have the right to terminate this agreement by delivering prompt written notice to composer. Okay, so in other words, they have the right to terminate your agreement, right? They have the right to just say, okay, if you cannot deliver, then this entire agreement is null, and you have to return the money. And that's the next thing that it says here. Upon receipt of such notice, the composer shall return orchestra monies paid to him for the commission and shall not be liable to orchestra beyond the return of such payments. Now, I think this termination cancellation clause is a little bit skewed towards the orchestra or the organization. I also think there should be a clause that says that if the orchestra or organization cannot fulfill their end of the bargain, right, they need to also find mutually agreed upon time for this to be premiered. And if they cannot, well, the composer should retain the money. So I would say that this clause also, let's say if the fee is very low, this clause should be in there as well, because it should be equal. If the organization, for some reason, let's say they go belly under, it shouldn't be your responsibility to give them back your first half of the payment when you did nothing wrong. So that's going to be one kind of thing that I would also watch out for in your termination cancellation clause. So those are some of the provisions that I suggest that you check out when taking a look at a commissioning agreement. And if an organization doesn't provide you a commissioning agreement, don't be afraid to write your own and model it after some of the things that I told you today. Again, this is not legal advice, just suggestions, and this is a way for you to go back and forth with your commissioning ensemble. If you'd like to know more information about commission fees, what are some of the fees that you should ask for, and some other provisions that I might have left out of this talk, head over to my website, www.sadandhaddad.com/resources. And under the business tab, you'll see a link for commission fees. And there's a very detailed PDF from Meet the Composer that talks about all of these things. So thank you so much. Please let me know down in the comments if you have anything to add to this. And if anything came up in your commissioning agreements, I'm really interested to know. And until next time, take care.